Jenny and Lee persevered with their attempts to get their little boy to settle on his own.
Basically sort of left him to cry for 10 minutes. Then we went in to check on him and to make sure he was okay and to sort of reassure him that we were still around and we still loved him as such. He did cry again when you left the room, and we were told basically by Glenys to stretch it out, sort of double the time each time we went up. So it was 10 minutes, then we left it 20 minutes, then we went in again, we left it half an hour. And eventually he actually did go to sleep. It was hard. We were very, very lucky, really. We only had 3 or 4 days of this. And now he's literally going down and not even murmuring. He's sort of been asleep straight away and sleeping most of the way through the night till the early hours of the morning.
If, like Lee and Jenny, you're trying to deal with your child's sleep problem, then it's important that you and your partner agree on what needs to be done and help each other to stick to it. Consistency is vital, and several nights of good work can be undone if one of you gives in just once to your child's crying. And Glenys Sykes also offers this piece of advice.
The advice we give, that it's wise to warn the neighbours that you're attempting this programme, because neighbours often worry when they hear a child who they're not used to crying for any length of time, suddenly crying, say, for half an hour. So if you tell your neighbours, then they will understand, and even if they don't like it, they will realise that there is a reason for it, and so they're less likely to call social services or make some sort of fuss which will cause a problem. So it's always wise to tell the neighbours.
With slightly older children, you may find it helpful to offer some kind of reward for the behaviour you're trying to encourage. But this can be quite a small reward. Professor Hill has one suggestion.
I think the system that many people find useful is a bit of string on the end of the bed with some very large beads, large wooden beads of the sort that are larger than those that normally go down children's throats. But big beads that can be threaded on a string and kept at the end of the bed seem to motivate small children quite well. And the parents come in during the night and put the bead on the string so that the child wakes up. And there is an extra bead on the string in the morning. If they have managed to stay in bed while the parents have been doing this coming and going ritual, that actually seems to work really quite well.
Another way of rewarding your child, which also seems to work, is to reward him stars for good behaviour, like the ones we got at school when we got all our sums right.
Children who are old enough to understand the star system works quite well. If you're going to use a star system, it really is a good idea to put it somewhere where everybody can see it, like sort of on the fridge door or something in the kitchen, and draw people's attention to it. And a small reward. You have to start perhaps giving a reward after, say, only 2 or 3 nights, because at the beginning a whole week seems an awful long time, and then to gradually extend it so you're not giving rewards all the time, and to make the rewards quite small and insignificant so that they can gradually be phased out.
But very often the best reward is your encouragement and praise, telling your child how pleased you are with him or her. The chances are that once your child has learned to settle by himself and go to sleep when he's been put to bed, then when he wakes in the night, he'll be able to get back to sleep without disturbing you. As we said earlier, settling problems are the commonest, but there are others. For instance, the whole sleep pattern may go completely haywire, and the child gets used to going to bed very late. Here, Glenys Sykes offers the following advice.
Well, you start establishing your bedtime routine at about the time the child will normally be going to bed. So if it's about 9, or perhaps start it a little bit earlier, because you're going to have this whole routine which is so important. But you perhaps start at 8:30 so that the child is in bed around about 9 or whatever time it normally happens. And then gradually, each evening, I would say, bring it forward by about a quarter of an hour or so until it becomes at a reasonable level. Because children do need a good sleep. All children need to sleep, so it won't do them any harm to go to bed earlier. But it may be that there's quite a difference between the time you're aiming for and the time you start at. People do worry that if they put the child to bed earlier, it will wake earlier in the morning and that they will lose their sleep then. That may happen to start with, but usually they settle into quite a good routine, and they don't wake up much earlier than they would have done anyway. We have some problems with, for example, a parent who is getting up very early in the morning, which does disturb. But again, the child has to get used to the normal sounds of the house, and the same thing applies in the evenings. It's no good disconnecting the doorbell or turning the television right down and things like that, because those things in themselves become quite disruptive and wake children. If they never hear sounds, they will not learn to sleep through them. And similarly, if people worry that the baby will disturb the older children, particularly if they're going to school, that they won't be able to cope, and they say, well, I always pick the baby up because it will disturb the other children. On the whole, as long as the older children are reassured that the baby is all right and this won't happen for very long, they will actually sleep through it. And if that is really a genuine problem, then I advise them to start it at, say, at the weekends or at half term, or sometime when it won't be such a disruptive factor.
Another problem with older children is waking early, usually followed by them coming into your room and bouncing on top of you.
A way of dealing with that is actually to use an alarm clock and set the alarm and say, when the alarm goes, you can come into our room, or you can wake us up, or do whatever. And that works quite well, particularly if the child's not actually old enough to read the alarm clock to tell the time. You can set it, in the first instance, you just set it quite close to the time they are normally waking up, say, for example, 5 a.m. But then gradually each night set it 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour later, so that the child gets used to waking for the alarm and then can come in. And on those sorts of circumstances, if you've told the child they can come in at such a time, then it should be welcomed into the bed in the morning. And really, you're using the same for quite small babies. If they know the difference between waking in the night and being expected to go back to sleep, but waking in the morning and then being welcomed into the bed, and that in itself is a reward.
Now, some of what you've heard may sound a bit unkind, especially the bit about not picking up a crying child. But helping your child to develop a sensible routine and a good sleep pattern benefits the whole family.
I think all parents need to be reassured that they're not doing something which is cruel for their own good. What they're actually doing is improving the lifestyle for all. Parents shouldn't feel guilty at needing some time to themselves, and particularly in terms of just recuperating from what is, after all, a very busy day looking after young children. But relationships need time to build, and parents need time to themselves in the evening, and that's very important, and they shouldn't feel at all guilty about that, because in the end the child will benefit from a more happy and relaxed parent the next day, and also from a better relationship between the two parents if they've had time to spend together.
As a child gets a little older, the amount of sleep he or she needs will decrease, but it's still important to have a good sleep routine. Dr. Guinevere Tufnell is a child and adolescent psychiatrist working in East London. She says that in school-aged children, quality of sleep is as important as quantity, and they do need it regularly.
As a child gets older and finds it easier to regulate their emotions and to calm down and get ready for bed without the need for a routine which involves the sort of bath time story and all that, and as they get more capable of settling themselves down, what they need is a regular bedtime so they know when it's time for bed. They know when their parents expect them to be in bed by, and that they are expected to go to sleep having got into bed. It does remain quite important, particularly for children, interestingly, who are, for example, hyperactive or perhaps very anxious and highly strung children. For them, it's particularly beneficial to have a regular and predictable time when they will be expected to settle down and go to sleep.
You may find it easier to enforce a regular bedtime if you're prepared to be a little flexible where it's appropriate. Most children have a later bedtime on Fridays and Saturdays than they do during the week. Even on a weekday, you could make an exception if there's a football match on television that your son especially wants to see, or a family friend is coming to supper. After all, learning how to negotiate and compromise is part of growing up. How about, you can come down in your pyjamas and have a drink with us before supper, but then it's teeth and bed. Or, you can watch the first half live, and I promise I'll video the second half so you can watch it tomorrow. You know your own child and their normal sleep pattern. A change in that pattern should alert you that something may be wrong, that perhaps your child is anxious or upset about something.
If parents notice that their child's sleep, having been perfectly okay, has become disturbed, most parents would think, is my child worrying about something? And most parents would find it useful to inquire of the child about the sorts of things that are likely to be making them anxious. And they might want, for example, to ask whether there's anything that they're worrying about, whether anything has happened at home or at school or with their friends, and try and help them to talk about whatever it might be that could be causing anxiety. Because once that you know what the underlying cause is, there are then various practical steps that the adult can take to help the child to resolve the issue or resolve the situation for the child if they're not able or old enough to do it for themselves.
One common anxiety among children is a fear of the dark. This might seem rather trivial to us, but for a child it can blight their bedtime and make it difficult for them to get off to sleep.
Often the anxiety is not so much of the dark, but when you examine why there should be this worry, you find out that it's to do with some aspect of being in the dark. It might be, for example, being alone. It might be, for example, memories of a frightening experience that happened, for example, a burglary that may have happened. It may be the memory of a frightening film or video that the child has seen. So it's very well worth trying to explore what are the worries associated with fear of the dark, and then seeing if one can try and help the child to deal with those and to come up with practical solutions which will help with that. So it might be things like a parent going up to their bedroom with them and making sure that they're safely settled into bed and that the room is safe before the light is turned out and they're settled down for the night. A night light may be a good idea, a dim light that can be left on all night. The child may find it helpful to have a story tape that they can play to help them get off to sleep. There may be things that the child would find it particularly helpful for the parent to do. So, for example, it may be that the child would find it reassuring for their parent to look quickly in through the door half an hour after they've settled down for the night to make sure that the child is safe. Again, often some of these things are really quite small, and children are very good at coming up with solutions to problems if you only ask them in the right way.
Many of the sleeping problems we've been talking about so far, like fear of the dark and difficulty in settling, are very common, especially among young children. Less common, but very disturbing for parents, are the night terrors experienced by some younger children.
Parents will be wakened in the middle of the night usually by a piercing scream from their usually quite young child, who will be sitting bolt upright in bed, looking absolutely terrified, eyes wide open, but not awake. They may be screaming, they may be flailing around, they can even get out of bed and start rushing around the room. They are definitely not awake. And because of that, it's quite important that parents don't treat them as if they are awake. The best approach to dealing with a child who's having a night terror is to be calm and make sure that they don't harm themselves by rushing around the room and tripping over things, and by basically trying to settle them back into bed and down to sleep as quickly as you can. So it's basically providing calm, reassurance and safety, but not trying to wake them up. They normally become more distressed if you try to wake them, so that the best thing really to try and do is to calm them down, because they're in a state of anxiety, but it's not like in a nightmare where they've been involved in a frightening story, really, in a dream which has contained frightening events. These children, when they do wake up, often have no memory of a dream, but just have a vague sense of being very anxious. So what the parent needs to do is to respond to the anxiety by providing a kind of calming presence and by helping the child to subside back into the sleep from which they've only half woken up.
Night terrors are related to sleep talking and sleep walking. Slightly less upsetting perhaps, but potentially very dangerous if the child's at risk of falling downstairs or getting out onto a busy road.
Sleepwalking and sleep talking are also so-called disorders of arousal, which really means partly waking up from a very deep sleep, going into a lighter kind of sleep, but not properly waking up. So you start doing things that you would do if you were awake, like walking and talking, but you aren't actually conscious at the time. And again, if children are woken up, or that if they wake up in the middle of these things, they very often don't remember anything about it. With sleepwalking, of course, the most important thing is the child's safety. A little boy I met recently was reported by his parents as walking out of his bedroom, down the stairs and out the front door. So the first thing we really had to talk about was how they could be sure that if he did start sleepwalking, or did continue sleepwalking, he would be prevented from walking out into the street where he might be at risk of being, harmed by passing traffic. And that involved putting a lock on the door at a level where the child couldn't reach it. So there are all sorts of practical things like putting locks on doors, putting gates on stairways, making sure that passageways are free of objects which can be tripped over, and that the child's bedroom has locks on the windows if the child is showing signs of trying to climb out the window. But parents really need to see this as a pattern of behaviour which is likely to be repeated, and which it's quite helpful to take practical steps to reduce the dangers.
Usually, night terrors and sleepwalking tend to subside as the child gets a little older, though they can continue into adolescence or even into adulthood. If the episodes of night terrors are very frequent and are disturbing everyone else in the house, or if you're worried about your child's safety when he's sleepwalking, then you may want to try and do something about it. Professor Hill has this suggestion.
The easiest way of doing something about it is to plot on a piece of paper what time on the clock these things happen over a week or 2 week span. If you can predict what time, and you very often can to within a quarter of an hour, it's most likely that the child is going to have an outburst of sleepwalking or a night terror, then what you do is you wake them up for a week, 15 minutes before that night terror or that sleepwalking is due. So let's say you plot it on a chart, and they don't have one the first night you do it, which is what usually happens. The second night it happens at 11:30. Third night they don't have it. The fourth night happens at 11:45. Then the night after that they might have another 11:30. Then you've already got enough information to know that if you went through a week going up and gently waking them up at 11:15, just gently waking them up, making sure they're awake, and then settling them back to sleep again. If you do that regularly for a week, you've got quite a good chance of stamping the problem out.
If that doesn't work, then it's worth talking about the problem to your GP. A short course of medication may be the answer, though clearly that's something you'd want to discuss very fully with your doctor, and he or she might prefer to get a specialist opinion. Not surprisingly, parents worry about the cause of these sleep disturbances and wonder if there's anything they can do to prevent them. Well, the answer is probably not. They sometimes run in families, suggesting an inherited tendency to develop these problems, and occasionally they're caused by some kind of stressful event, such as moving house or a serious illness in a family member. Dr. Tufnell.
I think that in all situations like that, parents would probably ask themselves, has my child been upset for any reason? And of course that's an excellent question to ask oneself, just to make sure that there isn't likely to be an underlying cause for the child to be doing this. But very often these night terrors can be completely unrelated to emotional upset. Again, unlike nightmares.
Of course, all children have nightmares occasionally, just as we do. The child may wake terrified and need to be comforted and reassured, or they may just mention it in the morning.
Often, of course, nightmares can be a part of being ill and having a high fever. That's a very common cause of nightmares. Another common cause of nightmares is having an upsetting emotional experience and perhaps being something that the child has not really come to terms with in another way, so that the anxiety comes out in their dreams at night. I think if nightmares are very frequent, then it is worth asking oneself, what might be causing this? And if the cause is not immediately obvious, to think about getting a more specialist opinion. Where there seems to be a recurrent nightmare, there is a particularly high risk of it being connected with an emotionally upsetting experience, and the content of the dream may well alert the parent to the nature of the experience or the upset that the child has experienced in life, perhaps some bullying or the death of a grandparent perhaps, or the serious illness of a family member. Things like that can be the cause of nightmares in both children and adolescents.
I would be concerned if the nightmare that the child had and was able to describe had a relatively fixed content. So it was the same sort of dream time after time after time, because that usually indicates that the youngster is having some difficulty thinking through, or really, I think the jargon word is processing, an experience they've had. It is actually possible to block dreams like that for a period of a month or two using medication, and that can break the cycle sometimes, because what sometimes happens with young children with repetitive dreams is that during the day they think a lot about the dream because it's an experience they have over and over again, and that makes them more likely to have it the next night. So if you block it by blocking dreams altogether, which doesn't matter with young children, it doesn't do them any harm, then you've got a chance of breaking the cycle up. So there are 2 or 3 things one can do, but repetitive dream would make me think that there'd been some sort of difficult experience, or perhaps a trauma, that that child has been through.
It is very often terribly helpful to get the child to talk about what was in the dream. Because for reasons that we don't completely understand, it does seem to reduce the frequency of the nightmares if the child can actually talk about them and get support from a sympathetic, understanding adult during the daytime when they feel secure and they can share the worry, really. So parents talking to their children and helping them to express either in words or in drawings what has been going on in the dream is a terribly helpful thing for parents to do.
If you are directly affected by the event which is upsetting your child, then understandably that may be very difficult. If it's one of your parents who's died, or if you were the driver of the car involved in the accident, then you yourself may be having difficulty coming to terms with it, and find it almost impossible to discuss it with your child. In that case, is there another family member who's less emotionally involved who can discuss it with your child in a sensitive and sympathetic way? I hope this tape has given you encouragement as well as straightforward, practical suggestions to help you deal with your children's sleep problems. But if you're at your wit's end, then Dr. Tufnell suggests that you enlist the help of the medical profession.
Given that sleep problems are really quite common and also quite easily treated normally, I would recommend that if the problem does not respond to simple measures of a common sense variety in some of the things I've already described, I would definitely suggest that they should discuss with their GP the possibility that a specialist opinion might be helpful, and that they can ask their GP to refer them to the local specialist. Depending a bit on what kind of a problem it is, it would either be a paediatrician, a child and adolescent psychiatrist, or if those 2 specialists locally have not been successful in coming up with the right answer, it may be that it's worth going to a specialist sleep clinic, which is likely to be located in somewhere like your local teaching hospital.
So please don't battle on your own. There are people who can help if your own efforts haven't been successful. Solving your child's sleep problems benefits everyone in the family. For instance, Lee and Jenny now get some time to themselves. Their little boy gets a good night's sleep, and they'll be able to help their new baby establish a good sleep routine.
If I was to give anyone any advice, my advice would be to let them know that you're boss, because as it stood before, Aaron knew he was the boss. He knew that what he wanted he was going to get, and yeah, it was hard, but very, very worth it. At least now I can sit down and watch a film and watch EastEnders without getting disturbed and things like that. And he's actually got a set bedtime now as well, which is nice. So, yeah, very worth it.